Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You didn't choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide. So whatever you ask in the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another. Here we have Jesus interacting with his disciples, and once again, it's kind of towards the very end of his teaching, kind of his last sit-down session, we might say, with clarifying some final points with his men. And what's going on? Well, they were to bear fruit and maintain connection with the vine. Those are kind of the central idea of these couple of paragraphs. And so why is Jesus saying this? Well, he wanted his followers to know that they're dependent on him, dependent on the Father and on the vine, that they're called with a great purpose, that there was to be fruitfulness and even great fruitfulness in their lives. And he wanted them also to see, there's kind of two paragraphs here. The first paragraph is that of abiding, the work of the Father as the vine dresser, and that fruitfulness, that sense of purpose. And then the second paragraph in this teaching is about community, about being a part of a community of faith that sees great fruitfulness, and that community experience is part of how that fruitfulness is to happen and demonstrate itself. And so Jesus is clarifying these things, and what parallels do you see with the passage we read earlier from Matthew 25? What are some repeated concepts? There's definitely a knowing of Jesus and the Father in this passage, and knowing the Master in the other one, that experience with God. There's a fruitfulness or a growth of whatever God's giving that's taking place in both of them. And there's this joy, the joy of the experience of the servant or the friend that the disciples had become of Jesus. This experience of joy in being about the Master's business or being about the Father's business. So, these passages have quite a bit in common. Well, what are maybe some takeaways of this passage, just looking at it very quickly and simply? Well, we depend upon God. Jesus is the vine. He's the source of all sustenance for what he's called us to be about. And prayer is repeated several times in this passage. I think verse 7, 8, and then verse 16, 17. Talk about prayer. Prayer is the expression of that dependence, calling upon him to do what only he can do. Another thing is that God, and this is the astounding part, as I think about fruitfulness in my own life, there's been periods where I've been astounded at what's happened, and there's been periods frequently where I'm like, is anything happening? How are we doing here? And this passage is so encouraging because the Father's the vine dresser, and he's diligently working that I might bear fruit. He's taking care of that. It's not, I have a responsibility, obviously, to abide in the Word, to abide in Christ. But the Father's at work to make me fruitful and even more fruitful, that fruit might be abundant. So if he's diligently doing that, it must matter a lot to him. And I think when we see what happens to the third servant who didn't multiply what he'd been given, just the harshness of that, this thing of multiplying, of bearing fruit, God God's really serious about that. But He's doing the work. He's the one who sustains and pushes that forward as we depend upon Him. And the other thing is this role of the church, of this spiritual community, this community of abiders, which are what you are. You guys are connected as a group of abiders that are abiding in His Word, abiding in Christ. And you're all appointed individually to bear fruit. But if you're not connected with Christ, nothing happens. And also, if we're not loving one another, not much is going to happen. Not as much as could. The fruit won't be as abundant. And so there's this community experience, abiding in God, communion with God, and communion with each other. These are two passages that are very motivational. They strike a great balance between the expectation of joy in walking and communing with God and serving Him, and the fear of messing it up and being a branch that's cut off, thrown out, and burned, or being a steward who doesn't multiply, who just kind of sits on things and who's thrown out into the darkness. So there's a harshness there, but there's this also expectation of joy. Well, thinking about kind of these principles of the seriousness of God about fruitfulness and multiplication in our lives, this wasn't lost on the men who heard this teaching. You go to Acts 3:6, and I'm advancing. Okay. You go to Acts 3:6, and you got Peter and John, I think, and they're waiting around like Jesus told them to, and they go to the temple, and Peter and John were going to the temple, and there's the beggar there. We know this story, and so they're doing their thing, and this guy says, "Do you have anything for me? I'm broke. I got nothing. I can't work." And they're like, "Got no money, but what I got, I'll give it to you. Stand up and walk. Be healed." And so they just multiplied what they had. Spiritual authority and power over sickness and disease and demons. That's what Jesus gave them. There wasn't a lot of funds moving around. It was just, that's what I got, multiply it, give it away, make it happen. And you look at Acts 20:24. Paul seemed to understand the seriousness of being about the Master's business, of seeing the ministry expand, and a sense of radical obedience. Acts 20:24 says, and the context is he's been through a couple missionary journeys, and he's going to return to Jerusalem.